What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and today I'll be doing an overview of the Assassination Rogue and all of the legendary powers that we'll be able to craft and utilize in Shadowlands. This video will cover the spec-specific options Assassination has, as well as the Rogue generic ones too, and how they interact with our toolkit. And you're probably thinking, well, gee, I haven't heard about Assassination since, like, BFA, because I didn't hear about it at all in beta information, and not really since the launch of Shadowlands, and that's because it's unfortunately not quite the poster child of DPS for raiding right now. And no, that's not just because of scaling and that it'll get better once we get more stats. It doesn't quite work that way. However, it is important to know exactly how all of these legendaries can influence our toolkit, because you never know when a tuning pass will sweep right through the game and then all of a sudden you might see a lot more poisons and bleeds on your damage meters. So let's look through these legendaries as Assassination. So if you're watching this in the future, this is a pre-Castle Nathria overview of the legendary powers, and is the last in my 3-part series where I've covered all 3 specs of Rogue now if you're interested in learning what options are looking good at the time of recording this. Due to numerous tuning passes that went through on beta testing, it is pretty unlikely that much, if anything, is going to change for Assassination's legendaries, but it's always a possibility, or other outside factors might influence the viability of each of these legendary powers. Just keep that in mind going forward, and hopefully this video will help you understand the strengths and weaknesses of each option, as well as their source in-game and what items you can imbue these powers onto. So we'll start with Assassination-specific legendaries first, and then move into the Rogue generic powers after. I'll be segmenting the video out so you can find or refer back to any info you're trying to find more easily. And while most of you are probably aware of this already, I do look at this sort of stuff from a PvE-specific standpoint for the most part. With that out of the way, let's start with the Zoldyck Insignia. This legendary comes from Torghast and requires you to complete the Coldheart Interstitio wing on layer 3 or higher. Torghast's wings are on a rotation, so you'll really want to keep an eye out for this one, as it is basically the ideal jack of all trades, master of all trades option. This legendary will cause your poisons and bleeds to deal 30% more damage if your target is below 30% health, making it effectively an execute phase damage booster for Assassination. This was a legendary power back in Legion and was considered a fantastic option then, and it still is, giving it the most consistent, highest overall DPS gain on any legendary for Assassination in virtually any PvE content. This option is of course only going to be a noticeable DPS gain once you reach that 30% health point on a target, so that can be considered a bit of a pro and a con, as on progression attempts or early into encounters, you won't notice anything of a performance gain. But overall it is still the best option across the board, and you will need either a pair of legs or boots to imbue this power onto. A potent single target DPS option is the Dashing Scoundrel legendary. This comes from the Council of Blood, a boss encounter in the Castle Nathria raid. This will cause the buff Envenom gives you to also increase the critical strike chance of your poisons by 15%, and when they do crit you gain 1 energy. This helps increase the energy generation of the spec quite a bit, as well as giving a nice and consistent DPS gain, as it is simply just extra poison damage. This pairs nicely with both the Lethal Poisons Conduit and Well-Placed Steel Conduit, which are 2 very strong options and both improve poison damage, so that's a win-win. In multi-target situations though, this is a lot less effective of a legendary, as your only way of applying poisons to multiple targets at a time is through Fan of Knives and Crimson Tempest, whereas your auto attacks will still be stabbing away at just a single opponent, meaning it doesn't really do that much for your AoE performance, and most of your energy regen in multi-target situations comes from venomous wounds anyhow due to multi-target bleeding. Still not a bad legendary that helps increase the playing speed of the spec a small amount in single target and is very consistent. For this legendary power, it can only be applied to either a cloak or boots. Next we have Doomblade, which is probably one of the coolest names for a legendary effect ever. This legendary power is earned by completing the Mortragar wing of Torghast on layer 3 or higher, and has a 2-part effect to it. Your Mutilates will deal an additional 30% of their damage over 8 seconds as a bleed, and your Envenom will deal 5% more damage for every active bleed you have on the target. This damage boost is affected by bleeds such as Garrote, Rupture, Crimson Tempest, Internal Bleeding, and even the bleed that is caused by the legendary, resulting in a total of potentially up to 25% increased Envenom damage. This legendary is pretty respectable in pure single target, though since it only buffs Envenom and Mutilate, it loses efficacy when you're not using either of these moves, which is generally the case in AoE situations where you start using Fan of Knives as your combo point generator instead of Mutilate, and generally you'd be running Crimson Tempest in heavy AoE situations as your AoE finisher. Due to this somewhat overly specialized usage, it is probably not something you'll end up crafting immediately, but if you do decide to do it, it would be either on a pair of shoulders or gloves to imbue the power onto. Lastly, for Assassination specific legendaries, we have Duskwalker's Patch. This legendary comes from Mistcaller, the second boss in the Mists of Tir-Nasith dungeon located in Ardenweald. Vendetta's cooldown is reduced by 1 second for every 50 energy you spend. This is basically the lowest performing Assassination specific legendary available, and is generally not something you'll want to spend your time or resources on without some big changes being made to it in the future, unfortunately. If you do decide to craft this legendary though, it'll need to be imbued onto either a chest piece or a ring. Now we'll go over the generic legendaries for rogues that we'll be able to craft and how they perform with Assassination's toolkit. First, we'll start with a legendary that I've grown quite partial to after a lot of usage across all 3 specs, and has fantastic usage in dungeons and does pretty decent for Assassination in single target usage as well. Mark of the Master Assassin. This legendary comes from the Affront of Challengers encounter, which is the first boss in the Theater of Pain dungeon in Maldraxxus. This legendary is a solid choice in dungeons for all 3 specs of rogue if you can take advantage of getting back into stealth, and the quicker your group can destroy trash packs, the better this legendary performs. Basically, this legendary gives you a guaranteed 4 seconds of critical hits for every time you leave stealth, hence why it is so important that you can re-stealth between trash packs and that your tank doesn't pull like a maniac. This of course means in lower keys it will look very nice. But even in higher keys, if your group can deal out some damage and go through trash quickly, it is still really strong. For Assassination though, it has the added benefit of having good synergy with the Seal Fate passive, which causes all critical hits from combo point generators to generate an additional combo point. This results in Fan of Knives being able to fully fill up your combo points in AoE situations very consistently. It also lines up perfectly with Vendetta since they're both 2-minute cooldowns, so in pure single target raid encounters, it actually performs pretty good. Still not the best in single target, but much better than it does for the other 2 specs. It's also exceptional in PvP, world content, and Torghast, and being a generic legendary like I mentioned earlier, it can be used by all 3 specs, so that is something that I would recommend that you consider using, especially if you aren't certain what spec you want to go with just yet. If you decide to make it, you'll need either a pair of bracers or a ring to imbue it onto. A pretty decent overall generic legendary is Essence of Bloodfang. This comes from the Stone Legion General's encounter in the Castle Nathria raid, and is actually one of the best heavy AoE options we can use. This legendary causes our combo point generators to have a chance to apply a bleed for 6 seconds, and 50% of the damage dealt from that bleed will heal us. Due to Fan of Knives hitting up to 8 targets, and counting as a combo point generator for each target it critically hits due to the Seal Fate passive, it becomes a pretty respectable heavy AoE option. For single target and low target cleave, it's pretty middle of the pack, and Zoldyck Insignia is just a far superior all-purpose sort of legendary, but it is technically usable by all 3 specs, which gives Essence of Bloodfang a little bit of flexibility. For crafting Bloodfang, you'll need either a helmet or a pair of shoulders to imbue. Our next generic power is Tiny Toxic Blade. This has a chance to come from the Great Vault weekly reward chest, and causes your shiv damage to increase by 350% and cost no energy. Naturally, this is an entirely pure single target legendary, and it's honestly not that terrible for it, as silly as it might sound to buff shiv. Obviously, as Assassination, we're using shiv on cooldown as a nature damage booster, so this doesn't even change our rotation slightly to take advantage of it, unlike both Outlaw and Subtlety who have to work this into the rotation. However, it is relatively lackluster as a single target option, with several options working much better in overall usage, and in AoE it becomes extremely weak as shiv can only be applied to 1 target every 25 seconds. If you do choose to craft this legendary power, it will need to go on either a belt or boots. Invigorating Shadowdust is one of 2 Vanish-oriented legendaries that we're able to craft. This causes Vanish to reduce the cooldown of all of our other abilities by 20 seconds, and comes from the PvP honor vendor in Ouroboros, costing 1500 honor. This is an exceptionally niche legendary with no really immediately obvious PvE gains to be had. It kinda works a little bit in Torghast since it's literally a duplicate of one of the Torghast anima powers you can use anyways, and it might have some PvP applications due to extra crowd control and utility, but for Assassination our only real DPS cooldowns are either Shiv or Vendetta, and we already have Duskwalker's patch which reduces Vendetta more than this does, and that's already a pretty weak legendary too, so really you would just get this for the beneficial effects of CC and utility. If you do want to craft this legendary though, it will go on either a neck piece or a chest piece. And lastly is Deathly Shadows. This causes Vanish casts to grant 5 combo points and give a 15% damage boost for 12 seconds. While Vanish lines up great with Vendetta, resulting in even larger damage boosts, it really is just not a terribly impressive legendary power in terms of raw performance. Being a generic power, it does have the small benefit of being able to be used by all 3 specs of Rogue for a minor DPS gain, and in Torghast I could see this being slightly more useful since there are anima powers that reduce the cooldown of Vanish and other things like that. This particular legendary power comes from completing Layer 3 or higher of the Fractured Chambers wing of Torghast, and can be crafted onto either a belt or a pair of pants. And there you have it, folks. Assassination Rogue and all of the spec-specific and generic options that we can effectively utilize. If I were to say just to pick 2 of these legendaries out of this chart, I would recommend Mark of the Master Assassin and Zoldyck Insignia. For spec-specific options, Zoldyck Insignia is by and far the best choice out of all of them. Even out of the generic ones, it is still basically the best choice in virtually all situations. Just having that nice execute damage on poisons and bleeds, which make up a massive amount of our damage, is pretty big. And Master Assassin is fantastic in Mythic Plus where you can get a lot of resets, but even in raiding, it's not too bad because it always lines up with Vendetta, which gives you a lot of burst with that huge 30% damage bonus you get from Vendetta, so having it crit for a good 4 seconds is pretty nice. It's also just really good in Mythic Plus and PvP and world content, and being a generic option, it lets you kind of mess around with all 3 specs if you're kind of trying to test the waters to see what you want to play exactly. And I mentioned it earlier, and I know that Assassination is not exactly the golden child of rogues right now, but there are a lot of theory crafters and people heavily vested in the spec that want it to perform well, and I know that they want that information out there so other people know how to perform well too. So I hope this information was helpful to you. If so, any likes, comments, or new subscribers are all fantastic ways of showing your support for the channel. If you're new around in my little corner of the YouTube algorithm, then I'd like to welcome you to come check out the rest of the channel. I do new uploads every weekday on a variety of content, ranging from overview videos like this one, to guides, tutorials, add-on stuff, week or stuff, and obviously rogue-specific things. I'd also like to take this time to thank all of my regular viewers, commenters, subscribers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.